Welcome to the video for Chapter 11, where we're going to discuss biodiversity issues. So in this chapter, we are going to look at the outline, biodiversity in terms of loss and extinction. We'll talk about the value of biodiversity. So what are some threats to biodiversity, and then what is being done to preserve biodiversity. And so to begin with, let's define biodiversity and define extinction. Okay. So biodiversity is a term that we use in science to describe basically the diversity or different amount of genes in a population, in a species, the amount of the number of different species in a region, or the number of different ecosystems in a region. So diversity you can think of as a term that basically refers to different. So it's kind of synonymous with different, right? So it's different genes, number of different species, number of different ecosystems, etc. So for example, if you have like a rabbit, a squirrel, and a deer all living in the same region, then you could say, okay, it has a species diversity of 3, has a species richness of 3, okay? You could do the same thing for genes, ecosystems, etc. There are lots of measures of diversity. You also can have functional diversity, which is basically what the species do as a role. So for example, how many different functions do you have? So if you have like an herbivore, there's one function. If you have a carnivore, there's another function. If you have a detritivore, there's another one. If you have a grainivore, so a species that only eats grains, there's another one. So that would be like 4 in terms of functional diversity. So there's lots of different diversity metrics that we can use to describe how diverse or how many different types of organisms or genes or ecosystems are in a region. Now, the term extinction is referring to the elimination of all individuals of a specific species. So with extinctions, this can be natural, um, well, and it can be a man-made extinction, so the result of human actions. And extinction is actually pretty common in the history of biological evolution. As we mentioned, I believe in like one of the first couple chapters, actually about 98 to 99% of species that have existed on the globe have went extinct throughout Earth's history. So it's really common, and we've actually had 5 big mass extinctions where a large portion of the biodiversity has went extinct during a specific time period. And extinction results in the loss of biodiversity. So if you have a rabbit, a deer, and a squirrel, and that squirrel becomes extinct, the number of species goes from 3 to 2, and you've lost the species, so you've lost the biodiversity. And like I mentioned, extinctions are also human associated. And so extinctions are a major consequence of human actions around the earth. Now, over the past 100 years, we've estimated based off of data, and so where scientists can look at extinction rates and how species show up and go out of the fossil record, and they can use that to estimate baseline extinction rates in the past and can compare that to extinction rates today. And by doing that, they've estimated that humans have increased the extinction rate from anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 times above the background rates over the planet's history. So this is a substantial increase. Okay. Now, with human actions, we're losing, say, or have lost 10% of the world's coral reefs. 1% of mangrove forests within the span of a year, an eighth of the bird species, a quarter of the mammal species, a third of amphibian species, and 50% of turtle species are not lost but threatened. They have the potential to go extinct within the next several years. And 25% of the terrestrial land has been converted into ag lands. So when you convert a forest to an ag land, you're going from multiple species living in that forest to that ag environment really only having one species, and that's the crop that it's growing. So you lose a lot of biodiversity when you convert natural habitats to ag lands. We also have a term that's known as local extinctions, or you may also hear it as extirpations. So a species has been extirpated from an area, and that means that there's this area that the species is in and it's been completely removed. So think of the Yellowstone example with wolves. So wolves were in Yellowstone, they were completely removed from Yellowstone, so they became locally extinct in Yellowstone National Park. Um, and then they were brought back, right, through conservation efforts. And local extinctions are actually relatively common and can give you an indication on how well that species is doing. And so if a species is going locally extinct, then it means the future for that species is probably not good. So it's not encouraging. As a population becomes reduced in size, you also tend to lose genetic diversity. So for example, you have a population of individuals, and let's say you have individual A that's has the green gene, individual B has a blue gene, individual C has the purple gene, and we'll do one more. We'll do individual D with the black gene, right? Now, when you reduce a population, you're essentially losing genes, potentially, right? Like if you remove individual B, then you lose that blue gene. Of course, there's going to be redundancy where multiple individuals will have that gene, but if you lose like 25% or 50% or more of that population, then there's a good chance that all the individuals with the blue gene are lost, or all the individuals with the A gene are lost. And so you go from having 4 genes, so a genetic diversity of 4, to a genetic diversity of 3. And so you lose that genetic diversity when you decrease your population sizes. And because of population dynamics and life history strategies of species, there are some species that are more likely to go extinct than others. And these species that are more likely to go extinct are species that are small, dispersed populations, and species where breeding is generally difficult. So it's difficult for them to find a mate, or maybe they only have one offspring every couple years, and so their population growth rates aren't very large. And so those are species that are more prone to go extinct than others. And so if we actually look at some life history strategies that tell you the probability of becoming extinct, we have this table here that kind of summarizes that for us. So you're more likely to become extinct if you have low population densities, so low numbers of species per given area. If you have a small distribution, so you're only found in a small area. If you're specialized, so you kind of focus on one type of environmental characteristic that you live in. And or if you have low reproductive rates. So again, maybe one offspring every couple years, or it takes a really long time for that species to mature. Maybe it doesn't reach maturity until it's like 5 years old or 10 years old, and then it has one offspring every couple years or something. So like an elephant, right? Those species with these characteristics are more likely to become extinct. Species that are less likely to become extinct have the opposite characteristics: high population density, lots of individuals per given area, large distributions found over a large area, large home range, a generalized niche, so they don't have to really specialize on a specific environment or climate or soil type or food source. They can get food from several different sources, or they can live in hot and cold environments, right? So their niche isn't as constrained, and or they have high reproductive rates, so mature very quickly, have lots of offspring, can replace themselves relatively quickly, so they're less likely to become extinct than species that are exhibiting traits from this first column. Now, if we look at extinction as a result of human activity, right, so as populations grow, and as they have grown in the past, the tools become more advanced. So for example, hunting weapons move from, maybe clubs and spears to bow and arrows, and then to, guns, that they can use to capture organisms and collect resources from species. And so they become more efficient at hunting and gathering the species. Environmental modifications also allowed for larger, denser human populations to survive, but again at the expense of existing ecosystems. So, for example, conversion to ag. Nearly most of the Earth's surface has been affected by human activity in some way, shape, or form. Now, it can be directly, right, where let's say deforestation, right, would be a direct one. And then it could be an indirect effect, right? So you're like, what about the poles, right? People haven't, affected every ounce of the poles. Well, pollution, right? So think about pollution. It travels in the atmosphere, and even though nobody may live in a specific area, pollution can be deposited. Particulate matter can be blown through the atmosphere and deposited in those locations. But what about the deep ocean? Well, there's microplastics, there's trash that gets put into the ocean. It can be taken by currents, and it can go into the deep areas of the ocean. Even though people don't go there, our trash and our other material can make it there. So there's also those indirect effects as well. Now, looking at genetic diversity more specifically here, like I mentioned earlier, genetic diversity is basically describing the number of different kinds of genes in a population. High genetic diversity means there's lots of different kinds of genes. So let's say we look at eye color, and we go to UC Merced, and you look at all the eye colors and you count them, right? Let's say there's like blue, green, brown, hazel, blue, green, and so that's 5 different eye colors. And so you could say, okay, that's 5 different genes, and so the genetic diversity is around 5 for that population. Now, if you went in and everybody had green eyes, and there was only like a couple of people with blue eyes, that would be a genetic diversity of 2. And so almost all the individuals in that population would then share the same genes for eye color. And so they would have the same characteristics. And so high genetic diversity, many different kinds of genes, so many different characteristics in the population. Low genetic diversity means that most individuals share the same genes and share the same characteristics. Now, there are a couple of things that can affect genetic diversity. One is mutations. So you can get a mutation in the gene that leads to the development of a new characteristic, and then now you have a new gene, and so your genetic diversity increases. Migration can also allow new genes to exist in a population. So let's say we have 2 populations, right? Let's say in this population you have species A, and then you have species B. Okay, and let's say in this population you have species B and you have species C. Okay, Now what can happen is individual A, well, let's don't say they're species, let's say they're individuals. So they're the same species in the two populations, but you have individual A that has the green gene, individual B that has the blue gene, and then individual C that has the red gene. And so let's say individual A migrates over here and has offspring with individual C. So that offspring now could have the A gene. And so now that A gene is introduced into that population through the migration of A into this population. And then C, right, could come across and breed and then introduce the C gene into that population. Okay, and so now the populations have the same genetic diversity when they were different to begin with. Sexual reproduction can also generate new genetic combinations. Okay, so let's say like you have an individual that has brown hair and is homozygous, and an individual that has, let's say, heterozygous, and another individual is heterozygous. Right, so both of these have brown hair, but they carry, let's say, blonde hair alleles. Now, if they have offspring, they have a chance of the offspring getting a lowercase b and a lowercase b. So hopefully you've had genetics and you kind of know what I'm talking about. And so now all of a sudden you have a blonde hair offspring, even though the parents were brown hair. So now there's these new genetic combinations that are existing in the population because of sexual reproduction and the recombination of those genes when fertilization happens. Now, with genetic diversity, population size is really important. We kind of mentioned this earlier, whereas if you have smaller population size, you have a higher chance of losing genetic diversity and also having less genetic diversity, right? So if you have 1,000 individuals, the chance that you have 10 different genes, per 1,000 individuals is pretty high. If you only have 20 individuals, the chance that you have 10 different genes is pretty low. So that would mean 1 out of 2 individuals would have to have a different gene. And so larger populations means that there's more chance for more genetic diversity. And so when you get lower population sizes, you get fewer variations. And then also random events can really alter genetic diversity in a small population. So for example, let's say you have a plot of flowers, and in this plot of flowers you have a red allele or a red gene, right? And then let's say you have a flower with the blue gene. So I want 10 individuals. Let me erase one. Makes math easier. Okay, so let's say this is a patch that has flowers. And let's say a random event happens. There's a tree over here. Okay, this tree, right? Let's say it falls down. And whenever it falls down, it randomly lands on these flowers. Okay, before the tree falls down, there are 10 flowers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those flowers have the A gene. So that means 60% of the population has the A gene. 4 have the blue gene, the B gene. So that means 40% of the population has the other gene. Now, when this tree falls down, let's say the tree falls down and lands across these flowers. And it's random, right? Let's say it lands this way. It could have landed this way or any other way. But let's say it lands across these 3 A individuals. So now the remaining population has 1, 2, 3 A's, 1, 2, 3, 4 B's, right? And that's out of 7 individuals. So now instead of the population having a majority A alleles, now the majority is B alleles, and you've lost a significant amount of A alleles. And so this is an example of a random event. So it's significantly altering the genetic diversity in that small population. Now, if there were 1,000 flowers here instead of 10 or 100 flowers and you lost 3 individuals, probably not going to make that big of a difference. But in small populations, you lose a small amount of number of individuals, makes a big difference. Okay. Then you also have selective breeding. So selective breeding can affect diversity because we can eliminate undesirable characteristics. So like whenever you do domesticated plants and animals. So let's say you only select for the larger cows. And so you can make your cows over time be larger on average because you're only breeding cows that are larger. So that means they have genes that are making them be at a larger size or a specific color, etc. Right? Or you can select for corn that's only yellow kernels instead of white kernels, etc. Okay. And so that selective breeding, you can select for specific traits and genes and remove others that you're not interested in. So ultimately changing the diversity of that population. Now looking at species diversity is just the number of different species in an area. And this refers to species richness, right? So if you have, again, a squirrel, a deer, and a rabbit, the species richness is 3. Those are 3 different species. If you have a snake, a frog, a turtle, and a deer, that's 4. So that's species richness of 4. Now you also can have what's called taxonomic richness, which takes into account the number of different taxonomic categories. And so let's say you have a squirrel, a rabbit, a snake, and a frog. So the snake and the frog are in the reptile amphibian category, and then the squirrel and the rabbit are in the mammal category. So that's a taxonomic richness of 2. Then let's say you have, your squirrel, your rabbit, your snake, and your frog. Let's say a turtle, a snake, and a turtle. And then we have a butterfly. Now we have a taxonomic richness of 3 because the butterfly adds to, say, the insects. So on and so forth, right? And so you can base it off of specific categories, and it can be, the genus, or it could be the family level, basically how you want to divide it up taxonomically. Now, factors that affect species diversity are factors that really affect kind of the location. So you can have migration, where new species can migrate into a habitat. So a new species could come in that wasn't there before and add to the number. The size of the area, so larger areas will generally have higher species numbers. Areas that have existed for longer times, so longer evolutionary histories, longer geological histories, will tend to have larger species numbers. And then human activity can alter species numbers. And one way human activity can alter species numbers is, 1, by causing extinctions and causing species to be removed from the landscape. 2, they can plant the same kind of species in an area. So here you have a pine plantation. It's all pine trees here, so low species diversity. The only tree here is 1 species. It's a pine, so species richness of 1. This desert ecosystem has many different species. It's been unaltered by humans to some degree. So it has different cacti species, it has different flower species. Those kind of look like poppies. There's another flower species there. There's a shrub there. There's another shrub species there. And so there's multiple species that you can see here. There's some grasses there, maybe some forbs. And so species richness is much higher here than here, right? This is driven, so this figure is driven by human interactions. And so next, looking at ecosystem diversity, this is just the kinds of ecosystems present in an area. And the area can be defined basically on whatever scale you want to define it on. You can define it on a large scale or a small scale. A lot of the regions appear to be uniform in terms of the ecosystems present. So for example, you have a lot of deserts around the world, And so while there are similarities in those deserts, each desert has specific organisms that are typical to the region, right? So the Sonora Desert has different species compared to the Gobi Desert or the Saharan Desert, even though they're deserts. And the species that live in those deserts have similar characteristics, similar life history strategies, similar adaptations. The species are different from the southwestern desert of the United States and the desert in North Africa. And then you also have local topographic conditions creating different patches of landscapes. Right? So differences in topography, differences in the way the sunlight, solar radiation hits the landscape, and you can get microclimates and microecosystems to exist in those different areas. Okay, so like here, you have a riparian habitat with the river. So you have a river ecosystem, you have deciduous forest, you have conifer forest, you have this kind of grassland, kind of alpine ecosystem where probably colder um, up in this area. So you have some ecosystem diversity within this little region here. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the value of biodiversity. Okay, so these biological systems that we've mentioned, these habitats that we've talked about over, the last several chapters, they have value. And we already talked about the fact that it's hard to value biological systems and ecosystem services. And so we defined ecosystem services a couple chapters ago. And remember, it's services and the resources that you can get from an ecosystem. So for example, a wetland area is really good at providing water filtration, providing good soils for crops, etc. So those are ecosystem services that it provides. And humans are dependent on the diversity of organisms on the earth. So for example, nitrogen fixing bacteria living in the root of certain plants allows nitrogen to be available for our crops and our soils so that we can grow those crops. If those nitrogen fixing bacteria aren't present, we have to synthetically fertilize our crops. Spoil building organisms live on dead organic matter, and that organic matter is provided by plants and animals that die in that location. And one thing is that it's really impossible for organisms to function optimally and efficiently unless it has interactions from various parts of the ecosystem. Okay. And so we've talked about nutrient cycling. We've mentioned the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle, and how they're all connected to different parts of the ecosystem. And so, for example, how the nitrogen cycle, is atmospheric nitrogen that gets fixed into ammonia, that's then turned into nitrate that the plants then take up, and then the plants die and then are broken down by decomposers that then convert it back into atmospheric nitrogen, etc. And so there's this intricate interplay with how ecosystems work and function together. And then there are also cultural uses from these ecosystems. You can enjoy the landscape. There's this aesthetic value, emotional value, emotional connection that people have with the natural environment, with the organisms that live there. The ecosystem provides an understanding of life, provides an area for scientific study, for educational activities, and then also spiritual purposes and spiritual significance of specific places and locations. Ecosystems also provide water regulation and water supply. So soil vegetation, slow water flow, prevents runoff, prevents erosion, and also allows that soil to penetrate and percolate into the ground and to recharge aquifers that we then get water from via wells. And that allows water to be available for agriculture, for industry, for home use, for our cattle, for irrigation purposes. And so it's all interconnected, and we really rely on the biological and the ecosystem services that are available from these ecosystems. Other really important services are disturbance regulation and erosion control. So for example, the vegetation and the plants, like I had mentioned in the last slide, help to slow erosion and help to hold soil together. If land is disturbed by fire, then all of a sudden erosion can happen a lot faster. Nutrients will enter aquatic systems a lot faster. Vegetation holds soil together and prevents landslides. Um, the colonization that happens after disturbances, right, allows for the animals and the plants to help regenerate that ecosystem and prevent continued damage. Decomposers serve as a form of waste treatment. They remove excess nutrients and pollutants from air, from water, from soil. There's ferns, for example, that can actually take up arsenic from the soil and remove it, which is pretty crazy. There's plants that can deal with, say, zinc pollution in soils that come from mining, and they adapt to kind of deal with those, and so they can kind of get rid of those pollutants and break it out of the system. They also provide food and raw materials, also provide medicine. They provide recreational services. They provide atmospheric cycling methods for gases. So for example, carbon dioxide is removed via photosynthesis and then stored in the biomass of plants and trees, which helps with global warming. Nitrogen and sulfur is modified by organisms, and we talked about the nitrogen cycle already. And then also biological control services. So you can use the natural food web, the natural trophic levels of an ecosystem to actually control pests. For example, organic farmers will often plant specific flowers next to their crops to attract certain insects that will eat the pest insects that affect their crops. So for example, ladybugs are really good at removing aphids. They love aphids. And so if you plant flowers that will attract ladybugs, then the ladybugs will get rid of the aphids that are eating your tomatoes. And so you kind of have these biological control services that we can utilize in order to help serve as an ecosystem service. And then the same thing for pollination services. You can plant flowers next to your crops, and that will attract bees. It will attract pollinators that will pollinate your crops. Those of you that live in the Central Valley around the orchard, you'll notice that people put out bee boxes because they need those bees to pollinate the flowers so that their flowers will turn into almonds and fruits and other crops that they then can sell. We also have habitat and refuges that allow for the protection of certain species or serve as nursery sites. We talked about this with mangrove swamps and estuaries serving as nursery sites for juvenile fishes, or like the Central Valley and the wetlands in the Central Valley providing a stopover place for migratory birds that are migrating from the Arctic down to Argentina and South America. And so those bird species will stop over in California, hang out for a month, replenish their energy in the wetlands of California, and then continue their migration southward. And so there are a lot of services that these ecosystems provide. Again, we have things like genetic resources. If an organism goes extinct, then we lose its ability for our own needs. Wild ancestors, for example, of our food grains are thought to be extinct. So for example, the corn that we are eating has been domesticated from wild maize, and some of those wild ancestors don't exist anymore in our crop plants because we've selectively bred them to extinction. 50% of common drugs come from plants and animals. And so if we selectively breed for those and harvest those, then we're losing those genetic resources. Soil formation is really important. So the weathering of rock, which happens from abiotic conditions and biotic interactions like bacteria, fungi, lichen, burrowing animals, right? Breaking down those components and adding to soil formation and soil development. And then our food supply depends on effective management of the soil because we have to have good nutrient-rich soils in order to grow our crops. And so it's important to look at all of these ecosystem services and actually see the value in these biological ecosystems, and that it's not just sometimes a face value that we see, like, oh, I can chop down this tree for wood, I can build a house with it, I can sell it, I can use it for fuel, I can use it to cook with, I can use it for heat. But that tree may also provide some other sort of ecosystem service that may be more valuable if we leave it um, intact and we don't harvest it for those other sources. And so it's really important to know and understand all the different ecosystem service values that come from different environments and different ecosystems. And so if we look at then the values and try to assign direct economic values, um, we can assign those values to services that are, say, provided by functioning ecosystems. Um, and so, for example, you know, what is the value of a wetland that will filter our water? Um, some resources, though, are very difficult to assign a monetary value. So, for example, wildlife or medicinal plants. What exactly is that monetary or economic value? So, in some cases, it can be easy, but in other cases, it can be very difficult. Um, we can make a case and say that all species have an intrinsic value, right? This goes back to kind of our ethical discussions in earlier chapters, and that they have a fundamental right to exist within their self. So extinction is not necessarily bad because it happens naturally, and as long as there's like these natural biotic interactions that's causing that extinction to happen, and it's not human initiated, then it's not necessarily looked at as being a bad thing. And experiencing these natural landscapes and processes is also looked at as being a human right. So it's looked at as, okay, this landscape exists, this place is beautiful, so I should be able to go get some aesthetic, recreational, or spiritual value out of that, right? And so if we kind of estimate ecosystem services in terms of US dollars, right? So recreation, we're looking at like 3.5 trillion. Nutrient cycling is like 2.3. Soil formation is just huge at 17.1. Pollination, you know, 0.4 trillion. And so, you know, all the value of ecosystem services, we're looking at like $34.4 trillion that we're getting in values from these intact functioning ecosystem services. And values are often associated by experiences that cultures or populations have with a specific habitat or species. And so as you shift from rural to urban um, populations, there's this kind of decay or erosion of natural experiences that shape the values of people. So people that live closer to the land in these rural areas will hold a higher value to the ecosystem services and the resources that that land provides compared to people who live in urban city environments. They'll hold generally a less value for those ecosystem services. And the way these services are valued are important in determining how society approaches these threats to biodiversity. So if you're an urban individual and you don't value ecosystem services as highly, then you may not think it's necessary to save a specific species or to spend, $1 million conserving a specific area or habitat. Whereas if you're somebody who lives with the land in a rural habitat, you get a lot of your resources from the land specifically or directly, then you'll provide a lot of value and you'll want to protect that land much more than, say, an urban individual. And looking at like ethical values related to this, you have a lot of people that would argue that all species, right, have this intrinsic value and right to exist. And like we mentioned last slide and in the ethical lecture, this is an ethical position. And it's unrelated to, say, social consequences or outlooks and even economic considerations, right? So this isn't based off of what does it provide socially or financially. It's based off of an ethical position that this species is alive, it's existing, so it has the right to exist without our intervention. And so continuing forward with our discussion, next we're going to look at threats to biodiversity. So some of the major threats to biodiversity, so we have 5 major activities that threaten biodiversity by humans, and this is pretty much in the order, is habitat loss, overexploitation, introduction to exotic species, or what's also looked at as invasive species, predator pest control activities, and then climate change. Okay, so we're going to look at each one of these individually. So habitat loss. So the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. This group estimates that 80 to 90% of threatened species are under threat, are in that position because of habitat loss and fragmentation directly related to human interactions and human habitat destruction. And habitat fragmentation and loss is thought to be one of the primary causes of past extinctions. And if we have said previously that 40% of the world's land surface has been converted to cropland or permanent pasture, then that is a big habitat loss. So the most productive natural ecosystems, so forests and grasslands, which typically are the most diverse, are the first ones to be modified. And so the species that are there are the ones that are being primarily affected. And so pressures to modify the environment are greatest where you have higher population densities. And so those are the areas where you see this conversion to ag, because you need food and resources to sustain that population density. And then those are also the areas that need those biomass fuels. And so deforestation is a big process leading to habitat loss, because not only are you destroying a forest to make it or turn it into ag land, but you're also potentially using it for fuel, for building materials, and for grazing lands, so that you can get those resources or generate resources. There are forestry practices that basically involve a compromise where you can exploit the forest economically, but do so to where that forest is still providing and maintaining its environmental values. And so you can basically do sustainable forestry methods. Forested areas are really important because the trees and the vegetation reduce erosion, they reduce runoff, they modify the climate because they have what's known as evapotranspiration. And so they are allowing moisture to go back into the air, so they're affecting humidity, they provide shade, they provide microclimates, and then they also provide recreational opportunities. And so there's a lot of ecosystem service here that we're removing by utilizing a whole forest. Say, for example, clear cutting a forest. And that's kind of the most harmful way of harvesting a forest. So clear cutting is where you remove all the trees in the area. It's economical. You get the value of all of those trees, but you remove a lot of those ecosystem services. You increase erosion rates. You can potentially have landslides happen, mudslides, whenever you're on steep slopes. You're removing the evapotranspiration, so you're altering the climate. You're breaking up continuous habitat, and a lot of species don't do well when they have edge effects. So let's say you have a forested area that's really big, and all of a sudden you kind of log this area. Now you've created sharp edges where, say, like it's a clear cut field and then all of a sudden a forest. Generally you would have this transition, right, to where it's forested and gradually changes into a grassland or another ecosystem. But when you have those harsh edge effects, you're modifying the environment considerably. And so clear cutting not only increases erosion, increases runoff, reduces the effects of the forest on the climate, it changes the abiotic conditions. It also creates unfavorable habitat for the species in terms of edge effects, but you also can have fragmentation, right? So let's say you kind of cut and clear cut this area, you kind of do it this way. So now all of a sudden this habitat is fragmented from this habitat. And then if you clear cut here, now it's fragmented from this habitat. So you had this continuous habitat, but now it's broken off into, say, 3 patches that are greatly fragmented. Um, Another method of harvesting trees is through patch clear cutting. So basically you just clear cut small unconnected patches. So if you had a big area, you would clear cut, say, this area, and then maybe this area, and then maybe this area. And you still have this continuous habitat. So you're still maintaining connectivity, helping to preserve biodiversity, and you're not creating those large fragments. And then these will typically grow back a lot quicker because they are connected, and then they have sources of, say, trees, seeds, and other animals that can come in and recolonize those areas. The third method, which is selective harvesting, is where you go in and you harvest a single tree species. It's not as economical because it's not as efficient, but it reduces ecosystem damage. And selective harvesting is the most economically friendly harvesting method that you can do, but it's not the most economical, right? It is much more efficient to take a machine and to not care about what you're touching and clear cut a forest and then sell all of those logs and timber. It's not as financially efficient to go in, tiptoe around specific areas, only take out certain trees, and try not to damage the surrounding environment. It takes a little bit more money and time to do that, so it's not as financially efficient or economical. But it is kind of the best harvest if you want to reduce ecosystem damage and keep those ecosystems intact. Tropical forests have a lot of deforestation associated with them because there is poorer cultures in the tropics. They are not as well developed, and also they are cutting these forests to provide for or to provide resources. Basically, they'll clear cut a forest, burn it, and then plant their crops there. So they do like a slash and burn method. But the issue with tropical forests is that they typically have the greatest species diversity of any other ecosystem, and they're not as likely to regenerate after logging, because remember when we talked about the biomes, tropical rainforests don't have nutrient-rich soils. So it's much harder for those individual species or those forests to regenerate. And there are very few tropical forests being managed for long-term productivity and actually focusing on kind of environmental friendly harvesting methods. There's a lot of issues and concerns that come up due to tropical deforestation. So it reduces species diversity. It also impacts climate because you have that lowered evapotranspiration. A lot of erosion happens. those forests are removed, and so now they can't trap that CO2, so it could affect global warming and atmospheric gas concentration. And then the human population pressure is greatest in the tropics, and it's continually increasing again. Poorer cultures, poorer countries, population growth rates are typically high in those areas. So with increasing populations, you have increasing pressures. Um, what we also see with in terms of like forest harvesting and lumber resources is that a lot of lumber companies will um, clear cut an area and then replace it with a forest plantation. And you basically manage these forests the same way you manage crops. You plant a single species, they're even age, there's no kind of complexity in the canopy, and they're these fast growing varieties of these specific species of trees. Competing species are culled out and controlled by fire, and then they control insects by spraying pesticides. You can get harvestable trees in about 20 years versus 100 years in non-plantation forest. The quality of the lumber is reduced. You get low species diversity and low wildlife value. So these plantations typically don't have good biodiversity in terms of living organisms and wildlife like animals, fungi, etc. Usually it's just that species of tree that they're controlling for. So you get an area that kind of looks like this, very uniform, not much going on, really low biodiversity in these forest plantations. Now looking at rangeland and grazing practices. So rangelands are areas that are too dry to support crops, but they have grasses and drought resistant shrubs. And so you can use your livestock, you can graze your livestock on those rangelands. And the wildlife that are there are typically not native to the region. And so they have these inherent consequences because the species that grow in those regions typically don't deal with, say, herbivores, large herbivores or cattle growing or grazing on those grasses. And and so that tends to cause harm to the specific species that live there because they can't deal with that intensity of grazing. You can see here the use of rangelands across the globe. So out west, you have a lot of rangelands, nomadic rangelands. So they basically move from place to place, not permanent rangelands like we typically have out west and in South America and Australia. But there's still, this heavy grazing practice. When you have the conversion of rangelands to grazing, the domesticated animals, those large herbivores, can have big impacts on biodiversity. Like I mentioned, they have selective eating habits that the native species aren't used to having those grazing pressures implemented on them. And so they don't do well with that selective eating habits. And so they reduce certain species while encouraging others. So they changed the kind of species regime in those ecosystems. Um, and it's really important to regulate the number of livestock on rangelands, especially in dry areas, because if you have a lot of livestock, you can get overgrazing. And that overgrazing can lead to desertification. And this is where you have this arid, semi-arid land to basically be converted into a desert because of overgrazing, improper human use, over irrigation, that sort of thing. So basically moving water from that area to be used elsewhere. So these are some areas that are experiencing high or very high human-induced desertification. It's basically as a result of not using the landscape correctly and sustainably. Next, looking at habitat loss in aquatic ecosystems. So in marine ecosystems, much of the harvest that we do in marine environments is in the shallow parts of the ocean. Um, And this is where you can harvest those bottom dwelling fish pretty easily. You can drag your nets along the bottom and catch those fish. Now, what this leads to is disturbing the sea floor. So if you drag your nets over coral reefs or any of the other benthic environments, you're damaging that habitat. And then these nets aren't really selective. 25% of the catch in a net typically is bycatch, so it's undesirable and discarded. But because they were in the net, they were drug around and they were pulled up relatively quickly from their deeper environments, that usually leads to the death of this bycatch. So they're just discarded. And so they are basically killed and not used. Now, freshwater ecosystems are even more modified than, well, I wouldn't say more, but they're modified not only for harvesting fishes, but also for navigation, for irrigation, for flood control, and for power production, like we mentioned with the dams in the energy lecture, right? In the renewable energy lecture. And all of these processes here will alter ecosystems and change the kind of aquatic organisms that are present. So what you get is you get river channelization, you get pollution, you get invasive species, overexploitation, you get siltation, so silt building up in areas where it wouldn't build up if humans hadn't changed or modified that aquatic landscape. Humans also convert urban or they convert habitat to urban and industrial areas. So 4.3% of the US terrestrial land is developed as urban centers, industrial sites, or transportation infrastructure. These areas are covered with impermeable surfaces. So in this asphalt concrete area, water doesn't infiltrate into the ground and is not allowed to recharge aquifers. Plants can't grow there, and runoff happens a lot more because that rain will run off of the concrete layer, and then it's usually diverted into a storm drain that then puts it into a different location than it would have went into the soil otherwise. And the trend is getting greater and greater urbanizations. And so we're seeing larger and larger cities. We're seeing urban areas expanding with suburbs, ex-urban areas. And so these urban areas are just getting larger and larger, especially with populations growing as fast as they're growing. Another kind of issue for biodiversity is overexploitation. So basically over harvesting species. So ICUN suspects that overexploitation is responsible for over 30% of the endangered animal species and 8% of endangered plant species. So again, overexploitation is where you over harvest organisms faster than they're able to reproduce, causing their populations to crash and to get lower. So basically they can't keep up with how fast we're harvesting them. Overfishing is big in marine fisheries. So 70% of the world's marine fisheries are estimated as being overexploited and in danger of being overexploited. So the amount of fish that we catch has remained constant while the amount produced by fish farming has increased. And the commercial fishing industry has attempted to market species previously regarded as unacceptable due to the overexploitation. So now what we're looking into are facilities like aquaculture facilities where fish farming is becoming more important as a resource for fish production so we can prevent overexploitation. So currently 60% of aquaculture production is occurring in freshwater systems. What this does lead to is some environmental impacts though, where you get nutrient overload, those farmed fishes escaping into natural waters and causing issues for native fishes, and also land conversion, so converting land into these fish farms. And so these are, some examples of an aquaculture in an ocean and then an aquaculture in a freshwater ecosystem. Looking at unharvestable or unsustainable harvest of wildlife and plants. So cultures will go out and hunt animals and get the meat from those wild animals, and that's referred to as bush meat. So 70% of the wildlife species in Asia and Africa and 40% of species in Latin America are being hunted unsustainably. So basically, if that keeps happening, those species will most likely go extinct to overharvesting. And this is really big in subsistence cultures, so cultures that are living really, close to the land, getting a lot of their resources directly from the land. A lot of wildlife are considered delicacies in some places and are highly prized for the home trade, so for pets, or for the restaurant trade, which is again related to those delicacies. Harvesting of animals from the wild for pet and aquarium trade is actually a really significant problem. Um, they will destroy bird nests. They will remove individuals from their native environment, reducing their population sizes. And then they also introduce toxins into the environment, say to stone fish that they want to capture for the aquarium trade. Animals will also be hunted not for their meat, but for their value. So, for example, for skins or for ivory or for traditional medicine. So, for example, seahorses are really big in the Eastern cultures for medicinal purposes. And so seahorses are being over harvested for that particular reason. And then you have elephants being harvested for their ivory, rhinos being harvested for their ivory, exotic cats, for example, being harvested for their skins. So that leads to, over harvesting of those species. And then this is just a picture of animal products that are used in traditional medicine. Again, one of those big ones are say, for example, species that are seahorses that they'll like dry and grind into a powder, and then take that powder or drink it in a tea or something like that, where it's used as a medicine. Now, another way that biodiversity is affected is through the introduction of exotic species. And so exotic species are what we refer to as invasive species. Some introductions are purposeful, where people will purposefully let those individuals go. Others are accidental. So they accidentally say get out of a fish farm, or purposeful where somebody gets tired of taking care of, say, a python and lets it go in Florida. And now all of a sudden you've got pythons living naturally in Florida. Um, Globalization also spreads lots of invasive species around the world. I mentioned this in an earlier chapter when we talked about zebra mussels. And so the connectivity of the countries and the globe has led to more invasive species. And so the IUCN estimates that 30% of the birds, 15% of plants are threatened because they can't compete with invasive species. Generally, if a species is invasive, it's because it's a generalist species, does really well in multiple environments. And so it outcompetes native species that are especially specialized for that specific habitat and environment. You can also get introductions of diseases that can affect plants and animals. So, for example, the chestnut blight has pretty much wiped out all the chestnuts in the eastern U.S. Good luck finding one out in the wild. Other insects have had an effect on ecosystem structure. For example, the Asian longhorn beetle. And then freshwater ecosystems have been affected. And so we've talked about zebra mussels before. They're a big invasive species. And a lot of the, so like if you're in California and you go to a lake, some lakes will not let you put a boat in if there's water on the vessel before you enter the lake, because they're concerned that there may be mussel larvae in that water and that you will transplant mussels into that lake or aquatic system. So here's a picture of zebra mussel, and then here's a picture of an aquatic invasive plant that gets really thick and outcompetes a lot of other plants in aquatic systems. Some invasive species are listed here. So like your introduced species are like your sea lampreys, native species are like your brook lampreys, invasive Andromedas species are like certain trout, depending on your location. So like brown rainbow typically are introduced in some places, but they do occur naturally in others. And then you have like lake trout, brook trout, whitefish, etc. Then you also have systematic killing of organisms that also reduce biodiversity. So for example, large predators have been locally extirpated because they preyed on domestic animals. So for example, wolves. Passenger pigeons became extinct because of the conversion of forested land. Passenger pigeons used to be in flocks of millions. Now they no longer exist. And then you also have this predator-competitor control activities where this has actually been largely eliminated in North America. It's not really cost effective in a lot of cases. So what you would basically do is you would like release a predator to control a prey species. And so, for example, the control of cowbird populations has been used to enhance the breeding success of warblers because of a direct interaction. Or, you know, controlling predators by hunting and trapping wolves in certain locations to affect, say, how they interact with local livestock, etc. Is ways that we tend to lose biodiversity in ecosystems. And then one of the last forms that we're going to mention is climate change. And so climate change is a big issue for the survival of species. And that's because a lot of species, a lot of individuals of species actually live at the limit of their physiological tolerance. And so they could be on the edge of their optimal distribution. And if you get a slight change in temperature, that can basically push them into a threatened or extinction event. So species like amphibians, corals, Arctic species are super affected by warming from current climate change. So warming has been suspected to cause chytrid disease in frogs, which is a fungal disease. Melting of sea ice is changing migration patterns of polar bears and food availability to polar bears. And now you're even seeing polar bears go as far south to interact with grizzly bears now. And so they're actually hybridizing. And so if you're interested, look up a pizzly, which is a hybrid between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. We're starting to see a lot more of those now because the grizzly bears are moving upwards and polar bears are having to move downward in latitude because of the loss of sea ice. So now they're coming into contact with one another where they generally didn't overlap as much in the past. And so with all of these kind of threats to biodiversity, what is actually being done to preserve biodiversity? ICUN lists over 21,000 species as threatened with extinction. And ICUN will classify the threat of extinction into 4 categories. They can be endangered, vulnerable, rare, or indeterminate. So this is the worst, and this is the least, and then this is indeterminate, meaning that we don't have enough data to determine the status of the species. So Of the 25,000 vertebrates that are listed to be threatened, um, 41% of amphibians are threatened, 25% of mammals, 22% of reptiles, 13% of birds, 33% of cartilaginous fishes, which are your sharks, skates, and rays, and then 15% of bony fishes like bluefin tuna. And so while vertebrates only make up 3% of all species, vertebrates provide a large role in ecosystems. And an ecologist, E.O. Wilson, has described vertebrates as being the quote unquote backbone of diversity. So even though they make up a small percentage of global species, losing this amount of vertebrate species will be detrimental to a lot of ecosystems, and you will see a lot of ecosystem change if these species were to go extinct. Now, in terms of protecting biodiversity, there is some legal protection. So there's awareness and concern about biodiversity loss, especially in your more developed countries that are kind of more educated about this issue. And these developed countries also aren't directly tied to living and harvesting directly from the land like your more subsistence cultures and populations are. So most vulnerable species in the areas have already been eliminated, um, unfortunately. And the loss of biodiversity is generally not a high priority for the public in developing countries. And they're more concerned with like immediate food, such as immediate needs such as food, than they are with species extinction. The U.S. actually um, passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973. It basically says if a species is designated as endangered or threatened, the U.S. government has jurisdiction over those species. So basically, no activity by a government agency should lead to the extinction of an endangered species, and the government agencies can use whatever means necessary to preserve the species in question. Okay. And so when you classify a species as endangered, it's basically a species that has such a small population size they are pretty close to becoming extinct. They are in immediate danger of extinction. Threatened species are at a point to where they would become extinct if some critical environmental factor that's crucial to their survivability were to change. And the preservation question ultimately becomes one of really assigning a value to a species. And so some examples of endangered species are the black-footed ferret, the giant panda, the green pitcher plant, an ocelot, mission blue butterfly. List can go on and on and on. And so what we kind of need to get to is this sustainable management of wildlife populations. So basically, undergoing habitat analyses and management practices where we can manage a particular species. But in order to do so, we have to have a really good understanding of the habitat needs and the resource needs of that species. And we have to understand what exactly that species needs to survive. The animal's habitat has to provide the big three factors, so food, water, and shelter. And then modifications made to enhance the success of a species is known as habitat management. So we can provide good habitat management strategies with a higher understanding of species requirements to provide sustainable management practices for wildlife populations. Game species, for example, are often managed so they don't exceed carrying capacity of their habitat. We typically manage that species to be under carrying capacity, so their population growth rate will be in that exponential phase, right? So if you're managing it under that carrying capacity limit, then their population's always going to be somewhere in this phase. And so the managers, the wildlife managers, do continuous kind of population censuses to check if the populations are within the appropriate levels, and they govern basically the quantity of take for specific game species based off of where they're at in their population. We also want to make sure there's suitable habitat and protection of those habitats so that the wildlife can maintain the appropriate population size. So particular species will require a particular size of land in order to have a specific population size. So for example, a lion will require a much larger area than say a mouse to keep an appropriate and successful population size. High reproductive capacities and heavy protection have allowed large populations to come about from animals that once were on the brink of extinction. So the management strategies can and have worked. Um, Wildlife management often involves harvesting for sport and meat, so hunting activities is a good population management technique. Occurs seasonally, so you have different seasons in which you can harvest those animals. And if the populations get too small for a species, then you can do artificial introductions. So native species can be reintroduced into areas where they used to be present and have been locally extinct. Non-native species can be introduced for empty niches. So say you have an environment that once had a large carnivore and that large carnivore goes extinct. Well, you can bring in another large carnivore that is similar in terms of environmental function, and it can provide the same role as the extinct carnivore did. So that's kind of an example of where or how you could potentially fill that niche. And so here's a figure showing kind of harvestable wildlife. So say for example in July, there's 33 black-tailed deer per kilometer. This is where you can harvest that surplus and the population still would be okay. And so you would have this many individuals that you would be able to harvest, no more. If you harvest more, you would get below this line and it could have detrimental causes or detrimental effects on that population. Now, there are some difficulties in managing migratory animals, and so there's kind of some special issues um, that come about with that. So, for example, migratory birds that travel thousands of kilometers really need not only a single country or a single government managing them, but international agreements. Because those migratory birds, say, are going to travel from, Alaska into Canada, back into the US, into Mexico, potentially into Central America, and then down into South America. And so you have to have all of these countries and states working together so that they can make sure that these migratory populations aren't being overharvested or aren't being affected and negatively to a point to where their populations are not sustainable. Um, in terms of looking at sustainable management of fish populations. So like we mentioned, coastal regions are some of the most productive regions in the ocean. They're in the area where sunlight penetrates. So you have warmer water, you have nutrient deposition from the terrestrial environment, you have wave action that kind of mixes those nutrients. You have the development of phytoplankton, which is the baseline of the food web because of the sunlight and photosynthesis. So most of the fishing pressure is concentrated here. And so one of the big problems associated with the management of marine fisheries is agreeing on what are acceptable harvesting limits. Um, Humans also have easy access to freshwater ecosystems, and so it makes managing these ecosystems much more intense. So we have to continually analyze these freshwater populations, but they're typically easier to regulate because they're in a smaller political region. So like a pond or a river may just go through a state instead of many countries or many states. And so, for example, many North American freshwater fisheries are primarily managed based off of like a sport fishery management plan. And so fisheries biologists pay special attention to the fish populations, the water quality, and how human activities are affecting those fish populations. And so that does it for our talk and our chapter on biodiversity and effects of biodiversity loss around the globe. So here's the summary slides. So as always, look over them, use them to study. And again, these are the key ideas, not all of the ideas that you should take away. So make sure you study the entire chapter and lecture. And as always, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, feel free to email me or to ask these questions in the discussion board. And so with that, we will see you in the next chapter.